Good afternoon, everyone. My little talk this afternoon is about space exploration, what we've done already and what we will be doing in future years. So I'll run through first a sort of potted history. Now, most of us have heard of Wernher von Braun. He was one of the genius engineers of the 20th century. He designed almost single-handedly the V2 rocket for Germany in the war, which of course spoiled his reputation, but then he went to America and was the founder of the American space program thereafter, and really the master of modern rocketry. So looking at the history, that was the 1940s, and then the 1950s, of course, we had the Cold War, and we had the need for these intercontinental ballistic missiles, because he was instrumental in doing the design for the American missiles. And of course, what the Russians were then doing, and the Americans didn't really know, was putting up satellites using this technology. And the first Sputnik, as we know, was Russian in 1957. So that got the Americans working hard. The Russians were also first to put a man to space, Yuri Gagarin, in the early 1960s, followed by Alan Shepard, the first American, doing a similar sort of mission. But the amazing thing was that President Kennedy set them a target, and this is all in the 1960s, to get to the man to the moon by the end of the 1960s. And the leap in technology for achieving that was just incredible. And they did it, as we know. By the end of 1969, the first moon landing had taken place, and the landers came back successfully. So what then happened? I mean, we're talking therefore about 20 years, and almost everything that has been achieved in space was achieved in those 20 years. It's now 50 years since that achievement. So what's been going on? Well, in the 1970s, the big story on space exploration was the space shuttle. And in the 1980s, the first of two shuttle disasters took place. And frankly, space exploration went out of fashion, really more, I think, because of those disasters than anything. Also, the competition between the two superpowers had just about disappeared. The Russians could no longer afford the cost of these programs. The Americans had beaten them hollow getting a man to the moon, and they were in future, in fact, they did have quite a lot of cooperation between Russia and America during this period. It was part of the détente process. But things were going on mostly in the unmanned sort of field of space exploration. So by the 1990s, we had the first wheeled robot on Mars, which is in itself quite an achievement, an American achievement. We were also putting up much more by way of instrumentation. So the International Space Station, that started work just after 2000. The Hubble Space Telescope was a bit before that, doing a tremendous amount of scientific research in space from space. And some of the probes that were then put up, the automated probes to explore the far reaches of the solar system, such as Galileo to Jupiter, were all in the 2000s. And then the 2010s, I'm taking this in decades, as you can see, it was a bit more of the same. I mean, on Mars at the moment, we have the Curiosity rover, which has actually been happily trundling around one crater for the last 7 years. The other thing that happened in the 2010s was NASA started to work with commercial companies much more. So we've got even entrepreneurs like Elon Musk developing the biggest and most powerful rockets on contract with NASA for some of their work. So that takes us up to the present, and so what's happening now, and why is it worth just taking stock of where we are and looking to the future? Well, the answer is actually 2020, if we get over the current crisis, will be a very exciting year in space exploration, and the 2020s as a whole, and leading into the 2030s, will be back to what we saw in the 1960s in terms of really exciting new things. So what's happening? Well, the Chinese will land on the moon in 2020, so they say. They did their first orbital flight, the equivalent of Gagarin and Shepard, was only in 2003, so they've moved very fast. They have already soft landed a rover on the moon, and they plan by the end of this year, sorry, when I said 2020s, that China will land on the moon during the 2020s, before 2030. But this calendar year, they plan to do a sample return, which means a spacecraft lands on the moon, picks up rocks and brings them back to Earth, which again, obviously is a very high technical achievement. NASA now has a program from the American government to land man back on the moon by 2024, only 54 years after the previous one. And another Mars rover from the United States is planned for this calendar year. It's called Perseverance. The point about Perseverance is a bit different to previous ones. There's been a lot of evidence of certainly of water on Mars, and everybody's speculating about whether life might have evolved on Mars. And the new rover will be collecting rocks within a particular area and of a particular type that should give that evidence one way or another whether life has ever existed on Mars. It will also, this new rover, have a drone helicopter to take off and take pictures, which is the first so far away, obviously. There is a connection, by the way, with WA, Western Australia here. Some of the oldest living things on Earth are the stromatolites in Western Australia, and the NASA scientists have been looking at those in terms of what should they be looking for on Mars to see evidence of life. Talking about drones, the other drone which NASA plans to launch is going to Titan, which is a moon of Saturn. I'm not sure when that's going, sometime in the next few years. Why would it be Titan? Well, there are 3 bodies in the solar system that have an atmosphere thick enough to support a drone helicopter, and that is Mars, Earth and Titan. So moving on to the other countries, we've talked about China. China also plans to go to Mars with a rover this year, so they'll be catching up fast with the Americans there. There is also an European/Russian joint rover project named Rosalind Franklin, which in the context of Brexit may be a bit odd, but it was actually built in Britain and is part of a joint national effort. It's now in France being tested, and the other day a bit of it fell apart and they need to use some stronger glue. But these 3 rovers, the American, the Chinese and the European one, all planning to take off this summer because of the planetary alignment, and they'll all be landing about the same time in early 2021 on Mars. And that's about it, really. There's another quite interesting thing planned for the 2022-26 window. That's an unmanned mission to land on an asteroid, and Elon Musk has got a contract with the American government to do that. This asteroid is largely made of gold and other precious metals, and so the idea is, could they be mined and brought back to Earth? The US government target, they do now have one under President Trump, to land man on Mars is 2033. And of course we have space tourism now with Virgin Galactica and others. And other countries are getting in on the act. The UAE, the Emirates, are planning a Mars orbiter later this year. So it is actually, again, if you take this decade as a whole, coming back to what we saw in the 1960s, a real blossoming of space exploration, including manned but primarily automated missions. Thank you for listening.